Hello, everyone. Thanks, Yasmina, for the introduction. My name is Richard Bejtlich, and as some of you might have heard, Mandiant was acquired by FireEye at the very end of 2013. So I was the Chief Security Officer at Mandiant, and now I am the Chief Security Strategist at FireEye, which means I get to do more of these cool events, talking to you all about ways that you can try to defeat intruders. So I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to speak to you. I'd like to thank O'Reilly Media for that opportunity, and they do such a great job putting out books and organizing events like this. So why don't we go ahead and get started. Now, if you've ever heard me speak before, you probably know that I'm not a big fan of slides. However, this presentation Zen slide seemed to capture that very well. This, as you can see, is Darth Vader's attempt to use a slide to convince Luke to join the dark side. And we know that didn't work, but I thought it captured my overall attitude towards using slides. But given that there are people from all around the world attending, and you need something to take a look at, I do have some background material here that we can use to facilitate our conversation together. I am going to try to keep track of what's going on using Twitter. Also, we've got through the console here, we have the ability to take questions. If at some point we don't get to all the questions that are there, or you have supplementary questions for me, feel free to just tweet me directly or use the hashtag network security. My Twitter handle is TaoSecurity or TaoSecurity, so you can always hit me up that way. Well, who am I? Why should you care about what I have to say about finding intruders on your network? Well, at FireEye, my job is to think of ways to do this sort of work and to make sure that there are ways that work in the real world. And I base all my work on my previous experience. For example, when I was CSO at Mandiant, my job was to help protect Mandiant from a variety of intruders. And before that, I was the Director of Incident Response at General Electric. And at General Electric, we had you may have heard it before. It's a small startup based in Connecticut. Not really. There's more like 330,000 employees, 500,000 nodes, over 200 gateways to the internet. So it was quite a large endeavor, and I had a hardy team of about 40 people who helped me to secure that enterprise using various detection and response means. In addition, I'm currently, in fact, I'm sitting inside Brookings Institution right now. I'm a non-resident senior fellow there in the cybersecurity program, so I'm trying to bring some of these ideas back and forth between the public and the private sectors. And I am advisor to a small startup based in Cambridge called ThreatStack, which is concentrating on different cloud security endeavors. I started all this work back in 1998 as an Air Force captain in the Computer Emergency Response Team within the Air Force. And that was the first time I got exposed to network security monitoring, to threats that made network security monitoring important, and I'd like to give credit to the people that I worked with at the AppCert who helped me to develop these ideas and see them working firsthand. Now, the book that we'll be talking about today is my fourth book. I published 3 books in fairly rapid succession about 10 years ago. In fact, it'll be 10 years ago exactly this July. The first book was called The Tao of Network Security Monitoring, and it was an introduction to my overall philosophy as well as tools that you could use to implement that philosophy and processes that people could follow to implement that work. I also published with 2 of my friends, Keith Jones and Curtis Rose, a book called Real Digital Forensics. And even though it's been 9 years or so since that book came out, the thing that's really nice about it is that every book ships with a DVD, and the DVD has case material on it. In other words, there are hard drives, packet captures, and so forth that you can use to learn more about forensics. This is something I see is lacking in most of the forensics books that are out there. And by the way, there's lots of excellent forensics books. But what I like our book for is that it gives you the evidence to investigate, and you can see what the sort of approved solution is by taking a look at our text. What's nice, though, is that material is still relevant today. You could use modern versions of NCASE or SleuthKit or any other open source software or commercial software for that matter, analyze the evidence and figure out what's happening. And you may even find things that we put in there that haven't been unearthed in the last 9 years or so. The third book you see there is called Extrusion Detection. This book was published in 2005, and the focus there was on watching what's leaving your enterprise as a way to find out what's been compromised. Back then, this was sort of a new idea because we were just starting to see the rise of client-side exploits. Prior to this, everything was fairly server-side oriented. In other words, you had a system, it offered a service to the world, an intruder would find a vulnerability, exploit that vulnerability, and then take over the system. But around 2004, 2005, we started to see systems on the insides of companies begin to be compromised, and it was being done via client-side exploitation against mail clients, web browsers, and so forth, tools that people were using to interact with the outside world. So what's the new book about? Well, I got the idea to write this book after teaching a course for Black Hat in Abu Dhabi in 2012. I was teaching this course, and I realized while interacting with the students that there was an entire population of network security professionals who weren't familiar with the need to get visibility on the network. So I've done network security my whole life. I've worked on the host, and I've worked a little bit with memory, so I'm familiar with the other areas besides the network. But for me, the network was always special because it's the least common denominator of everything. We talk about the Internet of Everything, the Internet of Things. The least common denominator amongst all of those items is the Internet, is the fact that they are networked. And if you can get some visibility using the network, I find that it's some bang for your buck, and it can be a fairly cheap buck. It can be fairly cheap to get started. But the problem was many people didn't know how to get started. They didn't know where to begin, where to look, what software to use, what processes to use, what they should know, what they should be looking for, and so forth. So I decided to sort of go back to first principles and write this book called The Practice of Network Security Monitoring. And I wanted it to be the sort of book that it didn't assume that much experience, but you needed to know something about security. In other words, it assumes that you've been doing this sort of work for a little while, but that maybe you haven't brought the network to bear on the problem. So I wrote the book between January and essentially June of 2013 and published the book in July of 2013. And you can see the link to the publisher's website there. You can see that if you use this code NSM101 on the publisher's website, you can get the ebook and the print version at a discount. And also, the book is today's O'Reilly Daily Deal. So if you go to O'Reilly.com, you can take a look on the right side, click through, and I think you can get a good deal on the ebook. My final goal with this book was not only to start you on network security monitoring and to show you how to use this open source software, but also to provide a couple case studies. And in the case studies, I decided not to use Windows because everybody uses Windows, and I used a pure Linux environment for the different case studies. It really doesn't matter what operating systems are in play. What I was more interested in was showing patterns of activity that you need to look for when you're trying to defend yourself from various sorts of intruders. I wanted to start my discussion of how to do this sort of work by taking a look at time. Now, I focus on time because many of us in the security world think, I would argue, fairly statically. We sort of set things up in an engineering sense where you have a set point in time, you evaluate an offender, you evaluate the defender, you evaluate the environment, and then you sort of put those into motion or imagine what it would be in motion and stop it. And it turns out that in the real world, time is much more of an important factor. You hear sort of a part of this when you're in the Beltway. So I'm in the Beltway today, which is ironic, given that I don't live in the Beltway. But within the Beltway, the Washington D.C. area, you often hear various cyber proponents and DoD leaders talk about activity at network speed, or the speed of light, or the speed of an electron. And in my opinion, that is in some ways flawed thinking, and it's been thinking that was poisoned by the activity that we saw in between, say, 2001 and 2003, where the big problem was network worms, where you would have something like SQL Slammer or something else that would spread out very quickly, affect the whole internet in less than an hour, and truly there was no way to defend against that in human time because we're dealing with a piece of malware. Unfortunately, that sort of colored the thinking for really a generation of leaders who tend to think that everything has to happen in network time because it is theoretically possible for traffic to pass around the world in network time. Well, what I want to show you with this diagram here is that real-world intrusions don't take place at so-called network speed. They take place at human speed. The reason they take place at human speed is because there are humans involved. You've got a target that's a piece of technology, of course, but the person who's conducting the intrusion is limited by their own ability to see what's happening, adjust, and then eventually overcome the victim's defenses. And again, those victims' defenses aren't static. They can be static if no one's paying attention, but for the most part, you're dealing with some type of a dynamic environment. Well, let me describe what we have on the screen here. This is an excerpt from the book, and in fact, almost everything is an excerpt from the book in this presentation, but what I talk about here is the State of South Carolina Department of Revenue breach that Mandiant assisted with in 2012. Now, I'm able to include details from this because it's the only time that, the one of two times that a customer authorized Mandiant to go to the world with details about an intrusion. As a company, Mandiant and now FireEye, we're investigating anywhere in the order of 15 to 20 intrusions per week. In other words, we have that many concurrent engagements ongoing. But you never hear about them. And in fact, if you ever ask us about them and you try to get us to say details, we can't do it because we have non-disclosure agreements. Well, in this case, the governor of South Carolina, to her credit, wanted the world to know what was happening to show that she was taking care of this intrusion. So what we have here is an example where our best determination of how the intrusion began was with a phishing email that was delivered on August 13th of 2012. And you can see that there's a series of steps that the intruders took up to the point that they stole information. In other words, on the 13th, they delivered the phishing email. Someone clicked on that phishing email. It wasn't until 2 weeks later, however, that we saw the intruders make use of credentials that they stole during the initial phases of the intrusion. They then logged into the Citrix environment. You can see that they got passwords, they got access to the domain controllers, and so forth. The important thing on this timeline is the fact that although the phishing email was delivered and detonated on August 13th, the intruders did not start to actually remove data until September 13th. So we have an entire month of activity during which, if at any point the defender had taken a look at their network and seen what was happening, or for that matter, taken a look at hosts or memory or logs or any of the other forensic artifacts that could be analyzed, if they had taken a look during that time, they might have noticed something bad was happening and they could have cut the intruder off. And this, my friends, is the real paradigm change. I didn't say shift. I'm going to try to stay away from using too many buzzwords. But this is the change that we need to make as far as defense goes. Defense does not just mean keeping the bad guys out. If you can do that, and there's some great technology and processes and people that will help you with that, great. But if you can't keep the bad guys out, as soon as they get in, you need to detect them quickly and disrupt their operations. In some cases, an intrusion like this, you may have a month. In other cases, you may only have a few weeks, maybe a few days. If you're dealing with a truly elite intruder, you may be dealing with minutes. And one of the fastest intrusions we've ever noticed or been witness to doing Mandiant consulting was a 7-minute case from beginning to getting access to data. Now, thankfully, there aren't that many A-teams in the world that can operate that quickly. And in fact, if you're operating that quickly, you've already been inside that environment. You already know where to go. You know where the data is. But what I'm showing you here is that against many intruders, time is the key element. And if you're able to disrupt the intruder before they accomplish their mission, you win. But to do that, you need visibility. I'd like to talk briefly about something that isn't in the book, but which is something that is very important to me, and it's a focus now of the work that I'm doing, and I'll be starting fingers crossed, starting a PhD in the fall that's going to focus on this very topic. And that's the use of strategy in the digital security world. Strategy is well understood in the physical world, and there's been some wonderful books published recently about strategy by King's College London professor Lawrence Friedman. But there's a disconnect. The disconnect is that in the digital world, in the IT world, many times we start at the bottom of this strategy ladder. In other words, we don't first think of what's the goal of our program, what strategies we should use to implement that goal, what operations or campaigns should be run to support that strategy, what tactics we use within those campaigns when we're fighting these battles against the intruder, and then finally, what tools can we use to implement the tactics. Instead, we often start at the bottom. What's the latest tool that's available? And then perhaps we get a little bit higher to say, what are the tactics we can use now that we have these tools? What I'm saying is we need to explicitly start with a strategic focus and say, what is the goal of our program? And write it down. Make this be something that people buy into. Because when you start having these conversations, the goal for some people could be 0 intrusions. And if you start from the premise of 0 intrusions, you're going to lose, because that's not feasible. It's not possible against the full range of intruders that are out there. So while many of you may have goals, strategies, operations, and so forth, it's very important to not make them just be implicit. You should make them explicit, so people know what it is we're talking about. And by the way, this is how you get buy-in at the high level of your organization. A CEO, CFO, CIO, they don't care about tools. They don't care about tactics. They are going to be interested if you talk about what's the goal of your program, what the strategies are that you use, and how you're putting that to work on an operational level. What are the campaigns that you're running on a daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly basis? Let me give you an example of what something might look like in this respect. So the goal for your program, you might say, would be to minimize loss due to intrusions. And by the way, there are so many other goals we could have. You could say transfer risk to someone else. I mean, when you start thinking like this, you sort of tease these things out. But let's go with this one example. Your program goal here is to minimize the loss due to intrusions. Notice that this accepts that there's going to be intrusions, and your goal is to minimize the loss. How do you minimize loss? Well, I would argue time is important. So the strategy, or a strategy we're going to use to to implement that goal, is rapid detection, response, and containment. In other words, the premise we're making is that if we quickly identify the intruder and we cut them off, that will minimize loss. Well, what are the operations and campaigns we're going to run in order to perform rapid detection, response, and containment? So we're going to do two sorts of things. We're going to match, and we're going to hunt for intruders using network security monitoring. Now, this isn't the only thing you should do or could do. This is one example, and you could have a whole tree of these that support each level. I'm just focusing on NSM for purposes of this webinar. Now, what would the tactics be that you would use to implement your campaign? Well, you could collect, analyze, escalate, and resolve incidents using NSM data. NSM data being the various forms of data that I've talked about in the book, and we'll get to that in a moment. And then what are the tools that you would use so that you would have the ability to collect, analyze, escalate, and resolve indicators? Well, that's where the NSM software comes into play. So I think this is a useful framework because it gives us a way to think about this and have a conversation with people who end up writing checks for us, who hire additional resources, and so forth. If you start from the bottom and say, I'm going to do NSM, I'm going to use NSM software, and so forth, the people at the other end of the spectrum might not understand what that linkage is. But if you start from the top and you work your way down, you've probably already sold them farther, almost at the very end of the process. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about where this sort of work fits. So this is what I call my enterprise security cycle. And like any security cycle that you've seen, it goes around in a circle, and that sort of indicates that this is an ongoing process. And this is key for me, is that this has to be a business process. It's not like a salesperson simply uses Salesforce.com and now they think they're going to win the next big deal. Or it's not like a human resources person is simply going to buy Newton software and now they've got a way to hire and retain talent. No, they need to be running a process. And so that's what I have here. And I've broken this process into two main chunks. The first one is plan and resist at the top. And the second one is detect and respond at the bottom. And I would argue that IT is mainly responsible for the top, and the security team, properly defined, should be responsible for detect and respond. Now, this is a model I've used for probably 10 or 11 years. And what's funny is that finally the analysts in the research community, particularly Gartner, are coming around to this. So I just saw a note that said they expect that 60% of the budget for the security team in the future is going to be focused on detect and respond, which that would mean that it's an equivalent amount of work being done by that team. What this means, in my opinion, is that we should be baking in more of that resistance stuff into what IT does. And if you think about it, I've worked at plenty of companies where the firewalls were managed by the IT team, antivirus was managed by the IT group, and so forth. In other words, things that work get managed by IT, and that leaves the security team to handle failure. In other words, there are people who are doing the positive work, and those of us who have to deal with all of the problems end up in the security team. Now, this doesn't mean the two teams don't talk to each other or they don't reinforce each other. In fact, you can see that I have one of the steps in the cycle here, resolve, is within the IT space, and that's because most companies, when they have an intrusion, it's the IT folks who have to restore the system to a trustworthy state. But this, I think, is going to be, it's the reality in many organizations, but it's going to be the future for most. You're going to have IT taking care of all the automatic things that you can rely upon, and all of the systems that you need to deal with failure, they're going to be run by the security team. Now let's dive in a little bit into detect and respond. And by the way, we're in the heart of material from the book at this point. Remember, the book is to give you an idea of how to find out what's happening and to make it into a business process. So it's not just all about software. In fact, I find that you could have the greatest software in the world, but if you're not using it properly, then you're going to run into trouble. And I think that's something that many of you have experienced. So what I have here is I have detection and response, and I've broken these out into their four components. Under detection, I define that as collection and analysis, and under response, this is escalation and resolution. So what am I talking about here? In broad detail, collection means gathering data that you can use to find out what's happening. And there's various forms of that. There's data from the host, from the network, application, data from a third party, someone else tells you that there's been a problem or they suspect a problem, or data from a constituent. And I use the term constituent to mean an employee, a partner, someone for whom you're responsible, and I use constituent to indicate that that person has a vote. In other words, they can help influence your program, because if you don't have the support of the people that you're securing, your life can be very miserable. So you have this set of data that comes into your enterprise, and I recommend you put it into some type of a data repository, whether you want to call that a SIM or enterprise log management, what have you. You then have a process of analysis, and there are two main ways, in my opinion, to do analysis: matching or hunting. And you see I use the terms IOC in both of these. IOC stands for indicator of compromise. An indicator of compromise is not a signature, but it is a way to identify malicious activity. As an example, the Mandiant APT1 report, which was released a year ago last night, has a whole section, 3,000 indicators of compromise that you could use to find APT1. That's the type of data that I'm talking about here. When you have IOCs and you know what to look for, I call that matching. That means you're looking for things that you can identify, and when you find them, you have a high confidence that they're bad. Hunting is different. Hunting is the process by which you find things you didn't know necessarily were bad. Hunting can be done by machines. Hunting can be done by people. On the machine side, this is the sort of thing, say, for example, the technology that FireEye has, the detonation chambers, the virtual machines that we use to figure out what malware is doing at all stages of its life cycle, and then either stop it or tell you what happened. On the human side, this is using a person and their innate talents to go out and look through data that was collected in the first phase and find things that don't belong. In fact, Mandiant has a hunt team that's headed by David Bianco, who some of you may know from his blog and so forth. And that is his job, and his team's job is to go through customer data and find intruders that don't want to be found by any means. And this, again, is another sort of high-end function that you see in various security teams that are dealing with the most advanced threats. Well, what do you do once you find something? Well, you have to tell someone, and that's what escalation means. I put this as its own step because, honestly, finding the proper person who's responsible for an asset, whether it's a computer or a database or a piece of data, that can be very difficult. And then finally, you have to do something about it, resolution. You have to contain the victim, you have to return the victim to a trustworthy state, and you have to learn from what happened and feed it back into this whole cycle. Now, I don't take a static view of this. This isn't something you just march through and then you're done for the day. All of this is happening all at once, all the time, overlapping. And it's really up to the team to figure out how much of this you can do in a concurrent manner. And speaking of the team, let me briefly talk about that. So I've been involved with many different computer incident response teams over the years, but this is the model that I tend to recommend, and it's the model that I used most effectively when I built my last CERT at General Electric. And this is the way I broke the team out. You have a director of incident response, and you have three main components within that IR team. You have an incident detection and response cell, you have a team, you have an applied threat intelligence team, and you have an infrastructure and development team. What do these groups do? Well, the IDR group, they're the people who have eyes on the network, eyes on the host, eyes on memory, eyes on logs, etc. They're the ones who are day-to-day, minute-by-minute, looking for intruders, and when they find things, they deal with them. I use three levels within that group: incident handler, incident analyst, and event analyst. I don't like to use Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, because who knows if Tier 1 is the highest or Tier 3 is the highest, and tiers are kind of, I don't know. I don't like that sort of hierarchy. Instead, I use these different terms. And the terms represent the level of responsibility you have and the way that you work. The incident handler is the person who is most responsible. This is the sort of person that I would feel comfortable having talked to the CEO of the company about anything. Now, they're not experts in everything because that's not possible, but they are, I have enough confidence in them that they could talk to the CEO or a business leader or outside the organization, and I would have full support for what they're saying. The incident analyst is someone who is aspiring to do that sort of work, but they haven't achieved that yet, but they have the prospect to do that. And then the event analyst is someone who is a little bit newer to the field, and they rely a little bit more heavily on playbooks. In other words, documents that say when the following happens, or when you find the following, here's how you're going to deal with it. And that gets to the second part. It's not just the responsibility, it's the level of structure that is brought to each job. An incident handler, in my opinion, is a very unstructured position, whereas an event analyst is a very structured position, and the incident analyst is somewhere in between. Let me give you an example. I would expect an event analyst to have a playbook, be able to follow the playbook, be able to implement every item in the playbook, but I would not expect them to go farther. If they do, and I would never limit them to just the playbook, but if they do go farther, they're showing the initiative that I would look at for someone to be promoted to be an incident analyst. On the other end of the spectrum, I have the incident handlers. These people, I'll just say it outright, I don't care how they get their work done, they just find stuff. And by the way, I don't mean they break the law or do anything unethical. I mean, if they want to mow their lawn at 10 o'clock in the morning, like one of my incident handlers used to do, that's fine by me, because I know that guy is going to be awake at 2 in the morning because he's a night owl, and he's just hunting through data, and he finds stuff that nobody else discovered. The incident handlers are the ones who, they use unorthodox means, things that haven't been discovered yet, to find the most difficult intruders, and they do so in an unstructured way. So that's the first group that you have to deal with. The second group is what I call applied threat intelligence. And the purpose of this group is to bring intelligence to bear against the problems that the first group is using. So you'll see I have different levels of analysts in that group. Now, sometimes this threat intel group is helping the IDR team, to do their work. Sometimes they're out in the business serving as internal consultants. In other words, they're taking the intel that they've learned from all the intrusions that this group has worked, and they're using it to improve the security of the company. Sometimes they're doing red teaming. Sometimes they're doing blue teaming. They're putting intel to work. So that's a broad category for that team. And then finally, I found that in pretty much every high-performing CERT, there's a group that is developing their own tools. Obviously, I work for a commercial vendor. I like the software that we sell here, but most organizations end up needing something a little bit extra, something that is custom for their environment. Maybe it only works with the software that they have. Most teams need some type of internal development group, and that's what I have here. You have some architects who work on network visibility. You have engineers who might develop their own software, their own ticketing system, whatever the case may be, and then administrators to take care of all the equipment that's being run by this group. I'm a firm believer in segregation between the administrators of a CERT and the administrators in the IT group. It's not that I don't trust the IT group, it's just that the IT group is going to be targeted by advanced adversaries, and if they go down and they also administer your sensors that are supposed to find intruders, you're going to go down. And when that happens, everybody loses. So there has to be a level of segregation between the people who control the sources and methods that you use to find intruders and the people who run IT. And then finally at the bottom here, I have what's listed as constituent relations. These are ambassadors for the CERT to the rest of the organization. These are people who may have worked at the organization for many years. They know how to get things done. I found these people to be valuable. Now, I want to mention that if you are a one-person team, a two-person team, you wear 5 different hats in your organization, I'm completely sympathetic. At Mandiant, my entire security team, not just the CERT, but my entire security team was myself plus 4 very talented people. So we had 2 people who were focusing on the incident detection response. I had a security engineer, and I had a security compliance expert. And that was what I was able to work with at my organization. So I'm completely sympathetic to those of you who have to deal with smaller organizations. What you see here is for someone who's dealing with probably a larger organization, or maybe something that you're aspiring to in the future. Now let me talk a little bit about why it's important to have network visibility. So I have here Intruder, represented by the black hat, and I have the pot of gold, represented by whatever it is they're trying to get access to. And you'll find that at various stages, you can stop these intruders, whether it's with a firewall or an IPS, or I should have thrown in here some of my, by the way, this comes from the book, so it's all pre my current job. You could have a detonation chamber associated with virtualization technology, like we have at FireEye. You could have AV and whitelisting, data loss prevention, or even a system of trying to enforce digital rights management on the data itself. The point is, there's usually a way to get past each one of these things. Not everybody can do it. Not everybody can do it all the time, but you need a way to find out what's happening. And honestly, I feel that the maturity of a security program is driven by your ability to identify when it fails. If you can identify when your security program fails, then you are way ahead of the pack, and that's the real way to define security. I wanted to also briefly talk about the kill chain, because I find it to be a fairly useful mechanism for talking about how to do detection. So I want to give credit to my friends Mike Klopper, Eric Hutchins, and Rohan Amin from Lockheed Martin for developing this concept. It's similar to other sorts of progressions of intrusions that you may have seen in my first book or in the great original Hacking Exposed book from 1999. But essentially, you're looking at a series of stages that have to occur for an intruder to win. And one of the cool things that I feel that the Lockheed guys did with the intrusion kill chain is represented in this next diagram. And that was using the kill chain as a way to map detection methods. And it doesn't just have to be a detection method. It can be a disruption method or all these other sorts of categories of activity they have. And you see on the screen here, these are some of the different sources that you could collect potentially to find out or to detect activity at different stages of the kill chain. I also wanted to share with you two metrics, and one of the metrics is categorized by the slide, and the other one I'll describe to you. The metrics are these. It's very important for any incident response team to track two key metrics. The first metric they should track is how many incidents have occurred and what were the nature of those incidents. And that's what's depicted on this slide here. Here is an incident category chart that I came up with, originally loosely based on some DoD categories, but then extended through my blog over the years. So that's the first metric. You want to track what's happening in your environment. But the second metric you want to track is how quickly you're going from detection to containment. Because if you are counting everything that's happening, that gives you an idea of the volume of activity that you can see. And if you're keeping track of how quickly you deal with it, it gives you an idea of how well you're accomplishing your ultimate goal of your strategic security program, which was to minimize loss. And remember, we're using time here. All right. Now, I see some questions have come in. What I'm going to try to do is get through my material, and then I will take a look at your questions. All right. So what I wanted to do was just go through a quick exercise to help you think about where you should try to get visibility. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about this book, Practice of Network Security Monitoring. We've done about a bunch of background around what it is we're trying to do, how to have some operations, and so forth. What am I actually supposed to do with this? So I have as an example a simple network. You could take this example and explode it in 5 different dimensions, but this sort of captures what I'm trying to describe as some of the problems you may encounter when trying to decide how to do network security monitoring. So with network security monitoring, your goal is to deploy a platform that's going to collect a variety of network security monitoring data. And that data is not simply an IDS alert, it's not simply NetFlow, it's not simply a packet capture. It's almost all of that. And I'll get to a slide that shows you what I mean in a moment. So what I want to do is I'm going to optimize for the scenario where I'm trying to find compromised systems, whether they're on my wireless network, whether they're on my DMZ network, or whether they're on my internal network. And in order to do that, I have to be aware that there's various flows of traffic that will occur. So for example, if I'm coming from the internal network and I have someone who's visiting a website, you'll see the traffic will go out to the web and it will come back. A different network flow might look like something like this, where I have a user that's on a wireless network. The flow is to go back out to that web server. Reply comes back. Here's another network flow. Here's an example where we have a server in the a server in the DMZ network doing a DNS request, maybe on behalf of one of the systems internally. You see that request goes out and comes back. And then finally, here's a different sort of flow where you have someone on the internet wanting to visit the web server that we have hosted in the DMZ. You've got a different sort of flow of information. Now, the reason I include this is it's important to figure out how to accomplish your goal here. You want to be able to see activity involving any one of those systems, whether it's on the internal network, wireless, or DMZ, whether they're going out to the internet or the internet is coming into them. So what that shows you is that you've got a variety of locations where you could possibly deploy an SM platform, and I've got these labeled A through I in this diagram. Now, there's an additional wrinkle here, and the wrinkle is it involves IP addressing and specifically network address translation. This is one of these ugly hacks that was created to deal with the scarcity of IP addresses, and it's still around today. So we have to be aware of it, and you'll see that there are the different segments have different IP address schemes, and we have to keep that in mind when we start analyzing some of these flows. And I've added specific IP addresses to some of the interfaces of the devices here to give us a little bit more color. Now let me go forward and talk about 2 examples. Let's say you've got the web server that has an IP address of 192.168.2.100. When that gets translated, and it turns out there's going to be multiple levels of translation here, I have a 1-for-1 mapping between the web server's IP and the IP that's being used by the firewall, and then finally the IP that's being translated again by the external router. So the web server, once it's seen on the internet, is 198.51.100.100, but the true IP address on the internal network, on the DMZ network, is 192.168.2.100. So one of the important things with NSM is to see who the original source is, and you have to be able to keep track of that. You have the same sort of problem when you're dealing with someone who's using the wireless network. Here you have a laptop, 172.16.1.50, again through multiple levels of translation, and you can see here that we're using network port address translation to involve the IP and the port. It becomes even more complicated. So it turns out that even though originally we thought we might be able to put a sensor maybe somewhere closer to the internet, because that was the common path between all these different flows, it turns out that if you want to be able to see the true source IP before there's any sort of NAT activity, you end up having to instrument in 3 locations, locations G, B, and H, as shown on this diagram. So what that means is that you should probably deploy visibility at those 3 locations. And you have a couple of choices. You can either span the switch ports that are the uplinks for those 3, so switch ports 1, 2, and 3, which correspond to G, H, and B, or you could use a tap. Now, that's just a quick overview of some of the decision-making you have to make, decision-making process you have to go through in order to define what's going to be monitored. I wanted next to quickly turn to Security Onion, because this, I think, is one of the highlights of the book, and what I think a lot of people like about the book is that I show you how to use what I consider the premier open source distribution for network security monitoring. And I'm not joking about that. I used to build my own distros, used to roll my own to do this sort of work. I gave up on that as soon as I started using Security Onion several years ago, because it's just that good. Security Onion is an open source project. It's run by Doug Burks and Scott Runnels, and you can see their Twitter handles there. And the website is securityonion.blogspot.com. Security Onion is probably one of the best run security, or really open source projects, period. And yet it's basically only a couple people with a few other volunteers that try to keep everything running. I would highly recommend taking a look at it. Well, why is that? So what? It's just open source. It's probably just a hodgepodge of different things. Well, what's happened with Security Onion is that Doug and Scott have taken and integrated the very tools that you need to find intruders in the enterprise, all using open source software. And I've broken them into 3 layers as depicted on this figure from the book. I break it up into the data presentation area, the data delivery area, and the data collection area. So at the bottom, you have a variety of systems that are simply collecting the data that you need to find intruders. For example, you have DumpCap collecting, you have NetSnifNG collecting full content data. DumpCap is available, but it's not running on demand, or it's running on demand. You have an Argus server who's collecting session data. You have Prads who's also collecting session and metadata. Snort or Suricata from the Open Information Security Foundation can generate alert data. And then we have what may be it's been described as a programming language that has a tool associated with it. We have Bro, who can provide a ton of different forms of NSM data, extracted content, session, transaction, statistical metadata, and alert data. At the top end of the suite, you have the data presentation tools. And these are the tools that you use to render or interpret the data that's collected at the bottom. And in the middle, I have what I call data delivery tools. This is more or less middleware that gets you from collection into presentation. Now, I hope that this slide, in some ways, by being a little bit overwhelming, gives you a sense of the complexity, and yet once you start using Security Onion, you'll see the elegance of this system. And what's also wonderful is that it's free. You simply download it, you install it, and you can get it to work for you. Now, there's 2 ways to use this software. One is in what I call a standalone deployment, and the other one is in a distributed deployment. In a standalone deployment, and this is what I recommend you try first, just to give it a shot, you set up the software, and you put everything on one box. It's the NSM platform, it's the sensor, it's the server, it's the database. It can even be the client. You can log in directly to that system. In fact, when I use a virtual machine or I teach, this is how I do it. So I recommend you try that setup first. However, once you get familiar with the software, you're going to want to run to let me just go through this quickly. This is how you use a standalone deployment against our sample network. You could have a single system. You give it 3 interfaces, or however many you need if you're connected to network taps. You instrument areas G, B, and H, and now you can see NSM data from those locations. Once you start using Security Onion, though, or really any NSM platform, and that's key, by the way, you don't have to use Security Onion to do NSM. You can do NSM with other software as long as it's collecting the right kinds of data. But in this case, if you're using Security Onion in production, you're going to end up separating the NSM sensors from the servers. So I have an example here where the server is the central point of contact, but there are sensors deployed around the enterprise, and you use a client to talk to the server in order to access the data. And on our sample network, this is what this looks like. You have 3 sensors that are collecting data. They're watching at areas G, B, and H, and then they're reporting their data to the server, and then you as the client connect to it and you access the data. Now, if any of this seems complicated, I walk through all of this in the book. I have chapters on how to deploy Security Onion either as a standalone or as a distributed platform. I show you how to use the ISO so you can just deploy it that way in the simplest form. I show you how to do a quick setup versus an advanced setup. I even show you how to use the Ubuntu packages that Doug and Scott roll that make this possible to deploy it on your own Ubuntu platform. So you don't even have to use the distro. You can use your own PPAs and get this thing working. So it's all in the book. I show you how to use all the tools at every step of the way. The last part of the book, I have case studies. And in the case studies, I show you patterns of activity, how they work, and then what they look like on the network. And the 2 patterns I wanted to show here were the server-side attack pattern. In other words, you have a victim who's on the internet, or on any network for that matter. The intruder finds something vulnerable about that victim. The victim's just sitting there. It's exposing a service like email or web or whatever. But through no fault of the victim, the intruder is able to exploit it. Of course, there's a vulnerability. It could be a 0-day, whatever, who knows. But after exploitation, you've got a network connection that is instantiated between the intruder and the victim. And there's 3 ways that can happen. The intruder can repurpose the existing connection that was used to exploit. You can have the intruder initiate a new connection to a backdoor, or you can have the victim reach back out to the intruder. So any one of these patterns may appear in your NSM data. The final example, or the second example, is the client-side attack pattern. And this is probably what most of us are more familiar with because it's what's popular today. But the server-side attack pattern is just as prevalent. About 30% of the cases we deal with advanced intruders started out with some type of server-side attack pattern, like SQL injection or what have you. In a client-side attack pattern, the victim has to somehow execute malicious code by virtue of interacting with some type of service, whether that's a website, using their mail client, clicking on a link, phishing emails, that sort of thing. In this case, I've got an example where the victim, say, gets a phishing email, they visit a website as a result of clicking on a link, and then there's some type of exploitation that occurs. And then you have that same network connection that allows command and control to occur between the intruder and the victim. So that's a brief summary of the sorts of material you'll find in the book, some background on why I wrote it and why you may find it interesting. The place to learn more about this, well, there's 2 really. One is to take a look at the book. I hope you like it. If you want more of this sort of thing, but in a 2-day format, I teach a class on this called Network Security Monitoring 101. And Black Hat just posted the training material for this class on their website. You can go to blackhat.com. blackhat.com/US-14. Now, I say this every year, but I think I really mean it this year. This will probably be my last NSM class. I've been teaching at Black Hat now 8 years straight. I taught several years before that, so I've got 10 or 11 or even, I think, 12 years of good teaching done with Black Hat. I think I'm going to hang it up at this point, but I do have 1 more class in me. And in fact, I have 2 more classes in me. I'm going to teach 2 sessions in Vegas on the 2nd and 3rd and the 4th and 5th of August. Both classes are the same. The first class tends to be a little bit smaller because it's the weekend class. The weekday class fills up pretty quickly, and it tends to be larger. So please take a look at that if you're interested at all in this material. So with that, I've got about 8 minutes, and I'm going to take a quick look at your questions, and I'm going to see what I can do over here. Let's see. I have a question about, can you talk a little bit more about how the hunt team functions? Yes, absolutely. So the hunt team does two sorts of activities. One, the individual hunters are out using the collected data to look for activity that they think is suspicious. Maybe they decide to use a new method that they've thought about to take a look at logs. Maybe they have a new idea for a signature they'd like to deploy, whatever. More interestingly, though, is what we call hunting trips. And the hunting trip is when the hunt team leader or a member of the hunt team takes some of the more junior analysts out hunting. And the way we used to do that was to have the hunt leader create a WebEx or a ReadyTalk or whatever, share his or her screen, and have the other members of the team join into that session, and then just watch and interact with the hunter to figure out what that person is doing. Why are you stacking all the services that were collected from the system, or why are you looking for activity of this type? And so it turns out being like an interactive session that ends up being a learning session as well. And the people who end up showing aptitude at the junior level to be hunters, they eventually graduate to being able to do that themselves. I have a question about what happened at Target. I'm afraid I cannot talk about that. Let me see. I have a question about how easy or feasible is it to consult on NSM versus being full-time in a company? Could you have a team that monitors from the outside? So I'm often asked this question, show me some vendors who can do network security monitoring. It turns out this is a tough thing to look for. What I would say is take a look at my book, look at the different forms of data in there, and ask your vendor, do you collect these types of data, and what do you do with it? You may find that there are some who do. You may find that some of them will look at you and say, we just run your IDS and make sure you get the alerts. So there's a vast disparity there. But it is possible to find vendors who might do this sort of thing. But I'm trying not to be a commercial here, so we'll just leave it at that. Let's see. Information sharing across companies. Okay. I hear a lot of commentary that only the bad guys share, and the good guys need to learn how to share as well. That's not true at all. Good guys are sharing all the time. There's private mailing lists. There's public mailing lists. There's the IT ISAC. There's other ISACs that are out there. Bay Area CISO Council, InfraGard. There's lots of forums for sharing. Is it possible to improve that sharing? Of course. The limitation, though, is trust. The more people you expose to the information, the higher the possibility that that next person you share with is the intruder. So anytime groups get too large, there's an inherent reluctance of parties to share their most sensitive data. So what I would say is start in a bilateral basis with people that you trust and people who can trust you, forge those individual relationships, and try to find like-minded groups that will vet members and speak on behalf of those members and not just let anybody in, because you never know who you could possibly be dealing with. I'll also say that there's some cool things that are going to be happening, I think, in the commercial space as far as information sharing platforms, but again, I don't want to go too far down that road. Question about data from a third party. What about trust? How do you make sure that they're reliable? Really great question. There's no reason necessarily that you should trust what a third party says, or even the third party could be completely honest, but what they're sharing with you isn't a problem in your environment. So this just comes down to trying to have processes in place to vet third parties. It's the same thing we used to do in the intelligence world when we had to vet intel sources. Turns out some sources were completely unreliable, others were always reliable. You just have to be able to bounce their information against other people and find out if it worked for you. I have a question about how secure is the use of a VPN in securing your internet connection over a wireless network. It depends on how you set up the VPN and whether you trust the software that's in use. We have seen cases at Mandiant of what we call VPN subversion. In other words, the intruders have found VPN clients. They have rewritten those clients. They have added extra features into the client such that it's possible to open up additional tunnels and essentially bypass the restrictions that you've placed on the VPN. So it's certainly possible to run into problems with that sort of thing. But that gives you another reason why you have to be looking for failure. If you're looking for failure, you're not just looking for the things that you trust to work, you're looking for the things that if you trust them and they fail, you'll notice. So in other words, a couple years ago when the whole RSA hack happened, that made a lot of us think, how would we notice if someone had compromised our credentials? How would we notice if we couldn't trust the RSA tokens we had? What are the ways that you can determine when something fails? And I think that should be an important part of your security program. Now, I haven't taken a look at Twitter, so let me just take a really quick look there and see if I can find anyone who might have hit me up for questions there. Let's see. Take a quick look. All right. I think I'm getting a bunch of people just talking about network security from a random point of view, so I don't think I'm going to worry about that for now. And let's see if there's any more questions. Let's see. I think that has hit all of the questions that I have. So I hope you've enjoyed this webinar. If you have any more questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. My handle there is TaoSecurity, all one word. And please take a look at the book. It's the daily deal right now on O'Reilly. And also you can hit it at nostarch/NSM. And if you want to get some in-depth training on how to use this software and how to run these operations, you can take a look at my upcoming class at Black Hat. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Yasmina.
Excellent presentation today, Richard. Thank you so much for spending time with us and for sharing all your knowledge and expertise.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Folks that attended our webcast today, we thank you for attending and also giving us your time, and we hope you benefited from the event. And for those of you that sent in your questions, thank you for those, because having your questions really adds so much to our events. We did push out links to you all in your group chat for Richard's book. You can also visit O'Reilly.com. Look on the right-hand side. It's right there. You can't miss it. It is the O'Reilly Deal of the Day, and you can get the ebook today at a great price. And there's so much information there that can really help you with your day-to-day, so we do hope you take advantage of that. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everyone. This will conclude our webcast. Goodbye, everybody.